All right, how are we doing? Okay, so I'm guessing like everyone in the room was here for the last one, and so you have no energy left to respond to my excitement about how we're all doing. Yeah, okay, we got some giggles. That's a start. Good, well done. Excellent. So for those of you that don't know me, which by this point, highly unlikely, but I forgot to say it before, so I'll say it again. I'm Andy. I'm on the program committee, amongst other things. We'll get Kelley started here in a second, not least because I know she's desperate to use all 25 minutes, and I'm using some of them up, so I'm very sorry, Kelley. I do want to remind people, please, in the app, if you add this session to your schedule, you will then be able to get into the session rating. That feedback is incredibly valuable, both for the presenters and obviously for the program committee. Please be supportive and constructive in your commentary, but that feedback will really help us. So I'd encourage you to do that. We won't have time, again, for questions at the end here, or at least it's highly unlikely, but we will have an opportunity to catch up with Kelley. She'll be around, so I'm sure she'll be happy. I'm just throwing you under the bus at this point. She'll be happy to take your questions if you have any, after the session. With that, we'll get started. Please enjoy. Thanks, Kelley.
Thank you, Andy. I think like most of you, I've been excited about Passkeys for a while. I was reading the WebAuthn spec back in the day, right? But there's always been this question of how do we make it accessible for consumers? And Passkeys have solved a lot of that problem because we have the idea of the synced passkey, right? We have this idea that you can recover passkeys across multiple devices, and they're also this very secure thing that's easy to use for consumers. But we still have this problem that consumers are human and we're going to lose things. So how do we think about this account recovery process? And I'm really excited to talk about this today because it's not something that I've seen addressed very specifically, especially at this conference. It's an afterthought in a lot of conversations that we're having. And today I really want to dive into what happens when the passkey doesn't work. What are we falling back to? Have they solved the account recovery problem? Let's get into it. My name is Kelley Robinson. I have been working at Twilio for 7 years on our user authentication and identity products. I was at Authenticate in 2022, introducing the idea of SMS pumping. So at that time, 2 years ago, a lot of people hadn't heard of this. We were just starting to see the attacks. This is something that a lot of people are now very familiar with. Big motivation for people adding passkeys into their applications. I've been looking at SMS pumping. If you want to talk to me about that later, happy to meet you out in the hall. But we're also looking at how we can use passkeys for the consumer authentication side of things. My background is as a software engineer, but I've learned a lot during my time at Twilio from both talking to our customers that are implementing a bunch of consumer authentication solutions, but also Twilio owns the Authy app. And so we've seen this from our perspective of running a consumer authentication solution. We have end users that are consumers, as well as I work with a lot of developers that are adding consumer authentication solutions on the developer experience side of things. So what we're going to talk about today is, after I give some context on how I think about account recovery, dive into some case studies, and also give you some specific recommendations for what you should be doing in your apps as you think about rolling out passkeys, as you think about the fallback options that you want to consider. And life happens, right? That's why we're here. Passkeys are a great solution for authentication, but users are still going to run into issues where they might not be able to use one. I think we saw in the last talk, if anybody was in that talk, the success rate with passkeys is so much higher than it is with something like passwords, but there is still going to be a situation where maybe the user registered a passkey on their mobile device and they're trying to log on to desktop, and that cross-device compatibility isn't working. Maybe they registered a passkey on 1Password and forgot to unlock their 1Password in their browser, and so they don't realize that they have a passkey saved for this site, so they're like, oh, I don't know if I can log into this right now. Maybe they registered a passkey on iCloud on their phone, and then they're trying to log into something on a Windows device that doesn't have access to the iCloud keychain. There is all of these use cases where a user might have legitimately registered a passkey and either lost access to that device where it was stored, it isn't getting synced properly. We have all of these cross-device compatibility situations that we're still working out how to make the user experience work well, so we still have to consider the backup options. And account recovery and this fallback is risky because you're not just authenticating, you're reproving that identity. And it's an identity that comes without a clean slate. It usually has money or data attached to it, and so we have to be careful with how we're protecting that, right? And I really like this definition from Mark Lovelace about how account recovery is a bypass of the main account security protocols and therefore should be treated as this alternative authentication system. And so if you have a really secure primary authentication method with a passkey, that's great, but attackers are already taking this into consideration, right? And if anybody's rolled this out, you've probably seen this. They know that they're not going to be able to phish a passkey, so they're looking at your backup options. And passkeys attempt to solve this problem, especially with synced passkeys for the consumer use case. They provide that backup. You can also register multiple passkeys. You can register them on different devices using different passkey managers, password managers, credential managers. I would love for us to, as a community, decide on what we're calling that. But Apple specifically calls this out in their docs. They say passkey synchronization provides convenience and redundancy in case of loss of a single device. Wonderful. But we run into this problem still, that people are going to lose access to those devices, and any amount of self-service account recovery is great because supporting account recovery gets really expensive. I've seen estimates as high as $70 a call for the cost of supporting an account recovery in your call center. TD Bank yesterday mentioned that it costs them about $7 a call, and that's on the lower end of these estimates that I've seen. This can be really expensive, and we all are familiar with this. And so while passkeys are great for a lot of reasons, they aren't the panacea for all authentication problems. They haven't yet eliminated the need for fallback options. This is something that we know, if you were in the keynote last night and saw the mountain that Microsoft is trying to climb in terms of how they're rolling out their authentication solutions. Yes, we want to get to the point where everyone has registered a passkey and all of the fallback options are these phishing-resistant authenticators. That's the ideal that I think all of us should be shooting for, but that's not going to happen tomorrow. Even Apple, who is one of the top adopters of both consumer passkeys in terms of rolling them out to their customers, and they provide the passkey manager, right, in the form of iCloud Keychain, they highlight their fallback options of passwords and SMS when they talk about recovering your account if you lose your passkey. This Wired article from February of this year talks about some of the challenges with consumer adoption of passkey. Passkeys are great, and it's a total mess. They note the front-end user experience is a little clunky still. You know, this was published before FIDO released updated UX guidelines earlier this year, and so I'm sure we've all fixed our UX, and now this is no longer a problem, right? Yeah. So this is something that I think we're going to have this kind of clunky experience from the consumer side for a while, and that's why we need to be thinking about both improving that, yes, but also how we think about what happens when that fails. But notably, I wanted to point out the academic research behind this. There's some great researchers that have been doing authentication research for the last decade or so. And so they looked at why people aren't adopting, or the challenges with adopting passkeys in consumer authentication. And the number one obstacle that they found, that there is no standardized fallback. What happens when a passkey doesn't work? So this paper is from 2024, and they talk about all of the issues that people are having with rolling these out, but specifically calling out the lack of standardized fallback options. So what are companies doing when they have issues with their passkeys? How are companies falling back to other options? I'm going to look through 5 examples, just a few case studies of companies that have rolled out passkeys for consumer authentication. I think, as we know, there's way more than 5 companies that have already rolled this out. But I think this gives you an overview of some of the options that you might have as a consumer authentication company. Cloudflare is one that I always like to look at. They've been kind of cutting edge with a lot of authentication technology. They were one of the first companies that rolled out WebAuthn. They have now rebranded that as Passkeys. When you get locked out of your Cloudflare account, some of the options you have: email verification. They also require an active browser session. That's something that's pretty common, but they call it out in their docs specifically. And then one One of the things that they also will add for their customers is a 3 to 5 day waiting period too. And so when you start to think about some of these recovery options, you're not only looking at the fallback options, but how you manage that, and that includes the timing that you might enforce on when you can re-access your account. GitHub, another company that caters to a more technical audience, right? They will allow you to fall back to any number of options, including OTPs, also your SSH key, I think is an interesting one. If any of you are developers in the room and you actively develop with GitHub, you probably have an SSH key saved on one or more of your computers that allows you to push code changes to GitHub. Of course, that works similarly in terms of cryptographic security to the way passkeys work, so they have that fallback option that has a similar security there, but they're also falling back to potentially less secure options like OTPs. GitHub has a pretty rigorous account recovery process. They do rely really heavily on recovery tokens as well if you lose access to your MFA. Anecdotally, I've heard friends that have gotten locked out of their GitHub accounts. What they will do is you will not have access to your account for 6 months. You can fork all of your repositories, especially if they're public, and then they will release your username to you 6 months later if it hasn't been claimed. So there's extreme examples here of how you might not be able to access that data that is associated with your account, but GitHub can be a little bit more of a risky platform than some of these other ones that I might talk about. So GitHub, Cloudflare, these are like the tech-focused companies. Let's look at more of these consumer-focused retail companies, right? Home Depot. Anyone that logs into their Home Depot account now will be pushed to create a passkey. This is great. It's a really user-friendly experience. But what happens when you don't have that? They automatically fall back to sending you an SMS OTP. And it feels like the focus here is really on enabling that user experience. And I think we even saw this morning Google talking about this. They're focused on enabling that user experience side of things rather than focusing on this high security focus that we like to talk about as an industry. And yes, passkeys are secure, but over and over again, this conference, I keep hearing that what everyone is finding in their user research is that people like the usability of this, and so that's where the focus has remained. Another general consumer brand, Target, does something similar. They will fall back to an OTP or a password pretty quickly. They haven't eliminated the password yet. Again, you're thinking about focusing on the user experience here, not necessarily pointing people always to the most secure option. Target also notes in their documentation, if you lose access to your email, you don't get your Target account back. And that makes sense, okay? Like if you're Target, you might not have that much attached to that account. They can say, we'll forgive this and we'll just assume that you don't ever need that account again. Create an account next with an email that you do have access to. That's not gonna be true for everyone. And finally, I want to highlight LinkedIn, and they do something interesting in the consumer space, which is they offer account recovery through government ID verification. And so they do document verification through a vendor that they will provide something like a verifiable credential that we were learning about, right? This is not something that every consumer authentication use case is going to have be applicable to them. This is something that we see much more often in workforce or enterprise authentication. But if you're a LinkedIn that is relying on your users having a real identity, this might be something that you can then fall back to, one of these verifiable credentials. So we've previewed some of these things in our case studies in terms of what your options are, but I wanted to categorize them a little bit further for you as you think about what might make sense for your company. And the requirements for account recovery methods are slightly different than classic authentication. Primarily, it doesn't happen as often as classic authentication, so when you're falling back to another option, and to be clear, I'm talking here like we're just assuming passkeys are not an option, right? Of course, we want to assume that everyone like has registered multiple passkeys, but at this point, we're saying you don't have access to your passkey, what can you do next? And so you want something that can be easily accessible if somebody doesn't remember it very often without that constant rehearsal that you might have of entering a passkey frequently, and something that's usable since most people end up doing this. Google research from a couple of years ago said that after about 18 months, I think it was 75% of their users had done an account recovery. I'm very curious to see how that data starts to change once passkeys become the primary authentication method. Is that something that then goes down that we aren't even seeing account recovery as much? I'm super hopeful for that, but I haven't seen that data yet. And each category, in terms of these methods, these categories, has a few different benefits and trade-offs. And so I'm going to walk through both knowledge backup, possession backup, and this idea of social proof. Starting with things that you know, I mean, I think everybody's favorite classic identity verification account recovery is, what was your mother's maiden name, your pet's name, these like security questions. We know that these are problematic, right? But knowledge factors are great because they can't be lost. They're easy to use and to set up. You might forget them, but it's less likely that you're going to forget something like that than a random password that you created. Of course, they have all of their challenges as well, because these are things that are easy to guess or research. If you ask me what street you grew up on, there's a good chance that I could figure that out. Possession factors tend to be more secure, right? Like they have the ability that they can't they're harder to phish, and they don't get leaked in data breaches. And so possession factors could include things like your phone, backup or recovery codes, hardware security tokens like a YubiKey, right? And while this is a really great option for a lot of account recovery, one thing that I want to point out specifically when we're talking about passkeys is that if someone loses access to their passkey, they might have also lost access to their device, and so some of these possession factors might also be lost, right? So how are you putting all of your eggs in one basket with where you're storing all of your backup factors? That's something that you're going to need to keep in mind. And finally, this category of social proof is an interesting one. So Apple does this. You can designate recovery contacts so someone can vouch for you if you lose access to your phone. Interestingly, Facebook used to offer this and no longer does. So if anybody from Facebook Identity is here and wants to talk me through that logic, I'd love to hear why that was discontinued. It was buried in settings and not ever advertised as far as I could tell, and we've learned that that is not a great way to encourage adoption of new authentication methods. But this is something that if you have any notion of social connections on your platform, might be a way to provide account recovery, federated access, if you have multiple people that are able to access the same account, like joint accounts or something like that. If you're a financial institution, one person gets locked out, the other person might be able to vouch for you. There's ways that you might be able to use this in a consumer authentication scenario. And very quickly, talking on backup codes, I've always been incredibly skeptical of these because there's no standardized way for storing these, right? So they're going to be more secure than a password because they're assigned to you, so they're not as likely to be reused. But then, what do you do with them, right? You write them down, put them in your password manager, print them out, and put them in a safe. Somebody told me they did that once, and I was like, wow, that's intense. But I don't know if people actually use these, and I was really pleased to learn that one of our customers anecdotally told us that 1% of their authentications every week come from these backup codes that are happening. And that is a customer that does millions of authentications, and so this is a large portion of that. And it comes back to providing this self-service option in terms of the account recovery use case. Backup codes are something that you can roll your own version of. It should be a relatively cheap implementation, and so this can be a valuable option. So given all of those options, what should you be doing, right? What can you be doing for authentication backup when passkeys fail? And I think it's important to preface this by echoing what OAuth says, which is that there is not a right answer here. And I think this comes back to the idea of why we haven't found this standardized fallback option, and maybe why FIDO hasn't had a official recommendation here. Which, by the way, if this is something that you're interested in, I'd love for this to start a conversation in terms of what should be the standardized option. Is this something that we should be standardizing? And so OAuth says there is no definitive best way to do this, and what is appropriate will vary hugely based on the security of the application, also the level of control over the users. And given that this is the consumer authentication track, and that's mostly the perspective that I'm coming from, that level of control over the users is going to vary a lot. The biggest thing that you can do, if you take away nothing else in terms of like your authentication recommendations for fallback options, is you always want to register more authentication methods than you need for everyday login. And this is account recovery basics, whether you're using passkeys or not. You need to register at least 3 methods if you're requiring 2-step verification, ideally even more than that. And you can also encourage users to register multiple passkeys. There is nothing that stops users from registering passkeys on multiple devices, and your setup as you're rolling out passkeys should encourage the ability to do that. Do design your recovery process based on the value that your business is protecting. Look at your ATO costs to understand how much you're using, how much is this actually costing your customer support center. You want to make sure that you're making the right level of investment for your business. If you're a higher value industry, if you are in financial services, crypto, these really high scale industries, make sure that your customers are going to understand the level of investment that they're putting in, the friction that they're going to be using in order to recover their accounts. Will they understand that 3 to 5 day waiting period? When you're, an app like Authy that makes somebody do a waiting period to recover your account, they probably understand that, right? Because that is an authentication product. They know that like somebody getting immediate access to that is probably harmful. But that might not make as much sense if you're Home Depot, right? Somebody probably is going to be like, why do I have to wait 5 days to recover my Home Depot account? You get the trade-offs here. Another thing that you can do is prompt users to confirm account information that could be used for recovery when they log in. This helps ensure that those backup factors are still relevant and valid. This is one way that GitHub does this. Same idea behind things like security checkups, email notifications to review your account. These things help keep information about the account relevant so that when you do need to fall back to these options that are not used very frequently, that they will still be useful and then available as a fallback or a recovery method. You can also be really proactive about these types of reminders. Another example from our experience running consumer support for the Authy app, we always saw customer support tickets go up at the holidays and new iPhone releases. And this makes sense, right? People are switching their phones at those times. They're often getting new phones. And so this is a very common time that people are going to then lose access to a possession factor. And that can include your passkeys. And so this is an example of something that Zapier sent me around the holidays a few years ago. Like the small cost of sending out an email like this is relatively small compared to the cost of account recovery. And we do also recommend adding waiting periods to deter hackers for sensitive accounts. So remember that your solution is never going to perfectly protect your users, but you want to deter people from trying to do the account takeover, make the cost of attempting an account takeover less than what they would be getting out of that. The goal is to slow down the attackers, and waiting periods are a very explicit way to do that, right? Again, using the Cloudflare example versus, a Home Depot, does this make sense for your business? GitHub does add a waiting period as well. Code can contain a lot of sensitive information, and so it makes sense that someone like GitHub would support this. Cloudflare's, I believe, is 3 to 5 days. Authy, last I checked, was 1 to 4 days, depending on the user. These are pretty common for sensitive accounts, and definitely consider the account recovery implications of that. And finally, don't let this discourage you. Just because passkeys might not be the perfect solution right now, just because you might not be able to get rid of all of your backup options, you might still need OTPs, email magic links, there's these things that you might still need to implement, that's fine. Passkeys are still the way forward. I think we've all come to agree that from all the great talks today. Even with fallback options that don't use public key cryptography, we know that passkeys still have the benefits, and I'm really excited to see how the industry standardizes account recovery and fallback options. If you have any ideas, know of anything upcoming, want to talk my ear off about that, I'd love to hear it. I hope this has given you some ideas for how to think about your own fallback options and your own account recovery. Once again, my name is Kelley Robinson, and thank you for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kelley. That was great. So I'm sure that there will be questions and follow-up and thoughts and ideas, and Kelley has very kindly offered her time to help with those.
I think Andy volunteered
later
my
on
time,
during the day.
I'll be out. There's a corner, the speaker's corner right outside the room.
Perfect. Thank you,
you.
Kelley. So if anyone online does have questions, feel free to put those in the app. We will try and get those through to Kelley. Not promising, but we'll do our best. Otherwise, we're going to take a couple minutes break. Let's have another round of applause for Kelley, please. She's moved. She's over here now. Fabulous. Thank you. We're going to take a couple minutes break, and then we'll be back for the last session this morning. Thank you.